What happens when love crosses the most dangerous line in 1849 America, when an 18-year-old enslaved boy and the governor's daughter shatter every rule of the Old South? This is a story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about courage, consequence, and the price of forbidden love. Before we dive into this incredible true story, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. The morning mist clung to the sprawling oak trees surrounding Governor William Hartwell's mansion like ghostly fingers, refusing to let go of the night's secrets. It was March 15, 1849, and the grand estate stood as a monument to Southern power and prestige, its white columns gleaming in the early sunlight like ivory towers of untouchable authority. Inside the mansion's pristine walls, 18-year-old Elias moved silently through the servants' corridors, his bare feet making no sound against the polished wooden floors. Born within these very walls, he had learned early that invisibility was survival, that silence was safety. His mother, Sarah, had whispered these lessons to him in the slave quarters when he was barely old enough to understand their weight. "Keep your eyes down, your voice quiet, and your thoughts to yourself," she had said, her weathered hands smoothing his unruly hair. This house has ears in every wall and eyes in every shadow, but 18 years of careful invisibility had not prepared Elias for the moment when Clara Hartwell first truly saw him. It had happened 3 months earlier, on a December evening when the mansion buzzed with preparations for the governor's annual Christmas ball. Elias had been tasked with moving heavy furniture in the grand ballroom when a crystal chandelier fixture came loose, threatening to crash down upon Clara as she supervised the decorations. Without thinking, Elias had lunged forward, catching the heavy crystal piece and pushing Clara to safety. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, their eyes had met, his dark and questioning, hers blue and startled. In that instant, something shifted in the carefully ordered world of the Hartwell mansion. "Thank you," Clara had whispered, her voice barely audible above the bustle of preparation. It was the first time anyone in the Hartwell family had ever thanked him for anything. From that moment, Clara began to notice Elias in ways that defied every rule of their world. She would find excuses to walk through areas where he worked, always offering a small nod or a fleeting smile. These tiny gestures, invisible to others but monumental to two young people, starved for genuine human connection, became the foundation of something neither fully understood but both desperately needed. Clara Hartwell, at 19, was the crown jewel of Mississippi society. Beautiful, educated, and expected to marry into another powerful political family to strengthen her father's influence. But beneath her perfect exterior lay a young woman suffocating under the weight of expectations and the cold emptiness of a house where love was a political strategy and warmth was weakness. Her father, Governor William Hartwell, was a man who measured everything in terms of power and control. At 52, he had built his political career on the foundation of strict social order and unwavering adherence to the racial hierarchy that defined the South. His wife, Margaret, had died when Clara was 12, leaving behind a daughter who learned to navigate the treacherous waters of high society alone. The mansion itself seemed to reflect the family's emotional landscape, grand and imposing from the outside, but cold and hollow within. Servants moved like shadows, speaking only when spoken to, their humanity reduced to their function. The enslaved workers who maintained the estate's operations lived in constant awareness that their lives could be altered or ended at their master's whim. Elias had grown up watching this dynamic, understanding from childhood that he existed at the complete mercy of the Hartwell family. His mother, Sarah, worked in the kitchen. His father had been sold away when Elias was 7, and he had learned to find purpose in the small tasks assigned to him, maintaining the grounds, moving furniture, running errands between the main house and the quarters. But Clara's acknowledgement of his humanity had awakened something in Elias that he had been taught to suppress. For the first time in his life, he began to see himself not just as property, but as a person worthy of recognition, kindness, and perhaps even affection. Their interactions remained carefully hidden and seemingly innocent, a shared glance when he brought firewood to her sitting room, a whispered good morning when their paths crossed in the garden, a moment of conversation, when she found him reading a discarded book in the library. "You can read?" Clara had asked one January afternoon, finding Elias absorbed in a volume of poetry that had been left behind by one of her tutors. "My mother taught me," Elias had replied, immediately regretting the admission that could be seen as evidence of dangerous education among the enslaved. But instead of reporting this transgression, Clara had smiled. "What do you think of Wordsworth?" That conversation had lasted nearly an hour, hidden in the mansion's vast library while the rest of the household went about their daily routines. They discussed poetry, philosophy, and dreams, dangerous territory for two young people whose worlds were never meant to intersect as equals. As winter melted into spring, their secret friendship deepened into something more profound and infinitely more perilous. Clara began leaving books for Elias to find, marking passages that spoke to her own feelings of isolation and longing for authentic connection. Elias, in turn, shared his observations about the natural world around the estate, his insights into the characters and motivations of the people they both observed daily. These conversations revealed to Clara a depth of intelligence and sensitivity that her privileged education had never exposed her to among the young men of her social circle. In Elias, she found someone who listened without judgment, who saw her as more than a political asset or a beautiful ornament. For Elias, Clara represented the first person in his life who had ever treated him as fully human. Her genuine interest in his thoughts and feelings awakened a sense of self-worth that 18 years of enslavement had nearly extinguished. But in the rigid social structure of 1849 Mississippi, their growing connection was not just forbidden, it was potentially deadly. The first signs of trouble came in February, when Clara's personal maid, Bessie, began to notice her mistress's unusual behavior. Clara had become secretive about her daily activities, often disappearing for hours with vague explanations about walks in the garden or visits to the library. More concerning were the subtle changes in her demeanor, a new lightness in her step, a tendency to smile at private thoughts, and an increased interest in the welfare of the estate's enslaved workers. Bessie, a woman in her 40s who had served the Hartwell family for over 20 years, understood the dangerous implications of any unusual interest Clara might develop in the enslaved population. She had seen other young women of the planter class develop inappropriate attachments that ended in scandal, punishment, and sometimes violence. "Miss Clara," Bessie had warned one evening as she helped her mistress prepare for bed, "folks been noticing you spending a lot of time wandering around the estate. Your daddy wouldn't like hearing about you talking to the field hands and such." Clara's response had been carefully neutral, but Bessie caught the flash of defensiveness in her eyes. "I'm simply taking an interest in the efficient operation of our household, Bessie. Surely father would approve of that." But Bessie knew the difference between administrative interest and personal involvement. She had watched Clara grow up, had seen her navigate the complex social expectations of her position, and she recognized the signs of a young woman whose heart was leading her toward dangerous territory. The situation reached a critical point in early March, when Clara missed her monthly cycle for the second time. The realization hit her like a physical blow, leaving her trembling in her bedroom as the full implications of her condition became clear. She was pregnant. The father was Elias, the 18-year-old enslaved young man who had become the center of her emotional world over the past 3 months. Their relationship had evolved from friendship to something deeper, culminating in moments of physical intimacy that Clara had never imagined possible within the confines of her restricted life. Those encounters had taken place in hidden corners of the vast estate: the old carriage house, a secluded grove of trees near the river, the mansion's wine cellar during the servants' evening meal. Each meeting had been fraught with the knowledge of the enormous risks they were taking, but also filled with a tenderness and genuine affection that neither had ever experienced before. Now, as Clara sat in her bedroom contemplating the life growing within her, she faced a reality that would destroy everything she had ever known. In the antebellum South, a white woman bearing the child of an enslaved man was not just a scandal. It was a crime that could result in social exile, legal consequences, and potentially violent retribution. For Elias, the consequences would be even more severe. Discovery of their relationship would likely mean immediate sale to a distant plantation, brutal physical punishment, or even death. The legal system offered no protection for enslaved individuals accused of sexual involvement with white women, regardless of the circumstances or the woman's consent. As March progressed, Clara struggled to hide her condition while grappling with impossible choices. She could attempt to conceal the pregnancy and give birth in secret, though the logistics of such a plan seemed insurmountable. She could flee the estate and try to disappear into the anonymity of a distant city, abandoning everything she had ever known. Or she could face the truth directly, knowing that doing so would likely destroy both her life and Elias's. The weight of these decisions pressed down on her like a physical burden, affecting her appetite, her sleep, and her ability to maintain the facade of normalcy that her position required. She found herself avoiding social gatherings, claiming illness to excuse her absence from the dinner parties and cultural events that filled the calendars of Mississippi's elite families. Meanwhile, Elias sensed that something had changed in Clara's demeanor during their brief, carefully hidden encounters. She seemed more anxious, more distant, and their conversations carried an undercurrent of urgency that he couldn't quite understand. "Is everything all right?" he had asked during one of their last private moments together, finding her staring out at the river with tears in her eyes. Clara had turned to him with an expression of such profound sadness that it took his breath away. "Elias," she had whispered, "what if everything we've shared leads to consequences we never imagined?" He had reached for her hand, a gesture that would have meant death if observed by the wrong person. "Whatever happens, Clara, I want you to know that these months with you have been the only time in my life when I felt truly alive. Neither of them could have predicted that within days their secret would be exposed in the most dramatic and public way possible." The revelation came on March 15th, when Clara's morning sickness finally overcame her ability to hide her condition. Bessie, bringing her mistress's breakfast tray, found Clara retching violently into her washbasin, her face pale and her hands shaking. "Miss Clara!" Bessie exclaimed, setting down the tray and rushing to her mistress's side. "What's wrong with you, child?" Clara tried to compose herself, but the combination of physical illness and emotional exhaustion had finally broken through her carefully maintained composure. "I'm fine, Bessie. Just a touch of stomach trouble." But Bessie had raised enough children and served enough women to recognize the signs. Her eyes widened as understanding dawned, and she stepped back from Clara as if she had been struck. "Oh, Lord," Bessie whispered, her voice filled with horror and disbelief. "Miss Clara, please tell me I'm wrong about what I'm thinking." Clara's silence was answer enough. The confrontation that followed was swift and devastating. Bessie, torn between loyalty to Clara and fear for her own position, ultimately felt compelled to report her suspicions to Governor Hartwell. The conversation took place in the governor's study, with Bessie wringing her hands and speaking in hushed, urgent tones. "Sir," Bessie began, her voice trembling, "I'm afraid I have some very disturbing news about Miss Clara." Governor Hartwell looked up from his correspondence, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to sharp attention, as Bessie explained her observations and suspicions. The color drained from his face as the implications became clear. "Are you absolutely certain?" he demanded, his voice deadly quiet. "Yes, sir," Bessie replied. "And, sir, there's something else. I've seen her talking to that boy Elias more than what's proper. I didn't think much of it at first, but now—" The governor's reaction was immediate and explosive. He rose from his desk with such violence that his chair toppled backward, his face flushing red with rage and disbelief. "Get out!" he commanded Bessie. "Not a word of this to anyone, do you understand? Not one word." As Bessie fled the study, Governor Hartwell stood alone, grappling with a reality that threatened to destroy everything he had built. His daughter, the symbol of his family's honor and his own political aspirations, was pregnant with the child of an enslaved man. The scandal would not only ruin Clara, but would end his political career, and potentially make him a target of violence from other white supremacists who would see his inability to control his own household as a sign of dangerous weakness. The confrontation between father and daughter took place that same afternoon, in the privacy of the governor's study, with the doors locked and the curtains drawn. "Clara," Governor Hartwell began, his voice controlled but trembling with suppressed fury. "I'm going to ask you a question, and I want the truth. Are you with child?" Clara, who had spent the morning preparing for this moment, lifted her chin and met her father's gaze directly. "Yes." The single word hung in the air between them like a death sentence. "And the father?" the governor asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Elias," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. What followed was an explosion of rage unlike anything Clara had ever witnessed. Her father's carefully maintained political composure shattered completely as he grappled with the magnitude of the scandal that threatened to destroy everything he had worked to achieve. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he roared, pacing behind his desk like a caged animal. "Do you understand that you've not only ruined yourself but potentially destroyed this entire family?" Clara remained silent, knowing that any response would only fuel his fury. "That boy will be sold immediately," the governor continued, his voice growing colder and more controlled as his initial rage transformed into calculating determination. "Tonight, I'll have him taken to New Orleans and put on the first ship heading anywhere. He'll disappear, and this nightmare will end." "No!" Clara's composure finally broke, and she stepped forward with desperate urgency. "Father, please, you can't—" "I can and I will," Governor Hartwell cut her off. "And you, my dear daughter, will be sent to your aunt's plantation in Alabama until this situation is resolved. We'll claim you're suffering from a nervous condition that requires extended rest and medical attention." The plan was coldly efficient and designed to minimize the political damage to the governor's reputation. Clara would disappear from Mississippi society for several months. The pregnancy would be terminated or the child given away immediately after birth, and Elias would vanish without a trace. The story would be that Clara had suffered a breakdown due to the pressures of her social position and required extended medical care. But Clara, faced with the imminent destruction of the only person who had ever truly seen and valued her, found a courage she never knew she possessed. "I won't go," she said quietly, her voice carrying a strength that surprised both her father and herself. "And I won't let you destroy Elias for loving me." The governor stared at his daughter as if she had become a stranger. "You will do exactly as I say, or I will have that boy killed tonight and claim he attacked you. Do you understand me, Clara? I will not allow this family's reputation to be destroyed by your foolishness." The threat was not empty, and Clara knew it. In 1849, Mississippi, the word of a white woman claiming assault by an enslaved man was sufficient evidence for immediate execution. Her father had the power and the connections to make Elias disappear permanently, and no one would question the official story. But Clara also understood that her compliance would not save Elias. It would only delay his destruction, while ensuring that their child would never know either parent. "Then I'll tell everyone the truth," Clara said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I'll tell them that I pursued Elias, that I initiated our relationship, and that I'm carrying his child by choice. I'll make it clear that he never forced or coerced me in any way." The governor's face went white with shock and rage. "You would destroy yourself to protect a slave." "I would tell the truth to protect the man I love," Clara replied. The word love hung in the air between them like a blasphemy, challenging every assumption about race, class, and social order that defined their world. As the sun set on March 15, 1849, the Hartwell mansion stood on the brink of a scandal that would reverberate throughout Mississippi society. In the slave quarters, Elias went about his evening tasks unaware that his life hung in the balance. In the main house, Clara prepared for a confrontation that would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of the man she loved and the child they had created together. The stage was set for a drama that would test the limits of love, courage, and human dignity against the brutal realities of a society built on the foundation of racial oppression and absolute power. The morning of March 16th dawned grey and oppressive, with heavy clouds gathering over the Hartwell estate, like an omen of the storm about to break. Clara had spent the night sleepless in her room, knowing that her father's threats were not idle and that Elias's life hung by the thinnest of threads. At dawn, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of waiting for her father's plan to unfold, Clara chose to take control of the narrative in the most dramatic way possible. She dressed carefully in her finest morning gown, arranged her hair with meticulous attention, and prepared to face the consequences of her choices with whatever dignity she could muster. At precisely 8 o'clock, as the household staff began their morning routines and several prominent visitors arrived for a scheduled meeting with the governor, Clara walked deliberately to the front entrance of the mansion. There, in full view of the arriving guests, the household staff and several enslaved workers who were tending the grounds, she called out in a clear, carrying voice, "Elias, please come here." The effect was immediate and electric. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, heads turned, and a deadly silence fell over the scene. Elias, who had been trimming hedges near the main entrance, looked up in confusion and growing alarm. He understood instinctively that something was terribly wrong, but Clara's direct summons left him no choice but to approach. As Elias walked slowly toward the front steps, his eyes downcast and his posture reflecting a lifetime of trained subservience, Clara stepped forward to meet him. The assembled crowd, which included 2 state legislators, a prominent judge, and several members of Mississippi's planter elite, watched in stunned silence as the governor's daughter positioned herself beside the young enslaved man. "Ladies and gentlemen," Clara announced, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal, "I have an announcement to make. I am with child, and Elias is the father." The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. Then, like a dam bursting, chaos erupted. One of the visiting legislators, Judge Harrison Whitmore, stepped backward as if physically struck. "Good God," he whispered, his face draining of color. Mrs. Catherine Pemberton, the wife of a prominent plantation owner, actually swayed on her feet and had to be steadied by her husband. "This cannot be happening," she gasped. "This simply cannot be happening." But it was Elias's reaction that cut Clara to the heart. The young man looked at her with an expression of such profound terror and despair that she almost broke down completely. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else present, the full implications of what she had just revealed. "Miss Clara," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "what have you done?" Before Clara could respond, Governor Hartwell burst through the front doors of the mansion, having been alerted by the commotion. His face was a mask of rage and disbelief as he took in the scene. His daughter standing beside Elias, the shocked faces of Mississippi's political elite, and the household staff frozen in various poses of horror and fascination. "Clara," he roared, "get inside this house immediately." But Clara stood her ground. "No, Father, I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of pretending. These people deserve to know the truth." The governor's political instincts kicked in as he realized that damage control was no longer possible. The scandal was now public, witnessed by some of the most influential people in the state. His daughter had just destroyed not only her own reputation, but potentially his entire political career. "Gentlemen, ladies," Governor Hartwell said, his voice taking on the smooth, controlled tone he used in political crisis situations, "I apologize for this unfortunate display. My daughter has been suffering from a severe nervous condition, and she is clearly not in her right mind. I assure you that this situation will be handled appropriately and immediately." But Judge Whitmore, a man who had built his career on strict adherence to racial hierarchies and social order, was not satisfied with vague assurances. "Governor Hartwell," he said, his voice cold and formal, "if what your daughter claims is true, then we are dealing with a criminal matter of the most serious nature." The judge's words sent a chill through the assembled crowd. Everyone present understood the legal and social implications of a sexual relationship between a white woman and an enslaved man. In Mississippi law, such a relationship was not only illegal, but was considered a form of rape, regardless of the woman's consent, based on the legal fiction that no white woman could willingly engage in such behavior. "The boy must be arrested immediately," Judge Whitmore continued, his gaze fixed on Elias with undisguised hatred, "and there must be a full investigation into how this abomination was allowed to occur." Clara felt the situation spiraling beyond her control. Her intention had been to protect Elias by making their relationship public and emphasizing her own agency in their connection. Instead, She had potentially signed his death warrant. "Judge Whitmore," she said, stepping protectively closer to Elias, "I want to make it absolutely clear that Elias never forced or coerced me in any way. Our relationship was entirely consensual, and I was the one who—" "Silence!" Governor Hartwell commanded, his political composure finally cracking completely. "Clara, you will not say another word. You are clearly suffering from some form of mental breakdown, and nothing you say can be taken as reliable testimony." But the damage was done. The assembled witnesses had heard Clara's confession, had seen her standing beside Elias with obvious affection and protectiveness, and had witnessed the governor's inability to control his own household. The scandal would be all over Mississippi within days, carried by the very people who had come to the mansion for routine political business. Mrs. Pemberton, who had recovered from her initial shock, stepped forward with the cold determination of a woman protecting her own social position. "Governor Hartwell," she said, her voice sharp with moral authority, "this situation demands immediate and decisive action. The reputation of every decent family in Mississippi is at stake." Her husband, Colonel James Pemberton, nodded grimly. "The boy must be made an example of," he declared. "If word spreads that such behavior can occur without severe consequences, it could encourage similar incidents throughout the state." Elias, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally spoke. His voice was quiet but clear, carrying a dignity that surprised everyone present. "Sir," he said, addressing Governor Hartwell directly, "Miss Clara is telling the truth. I never forced her to do anything, but I understand that my life is forfeit now, and I accept that. I only ask that you not punish her for my failings." The simple nobility of Elias's words had an unexpected effect on the assembled crowd. Several of the witnesses shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing a humanity in the young man that their social conditioning had taught them to deny. But Judge Whitmore was unmoved. "The boy's admission of guilt simplifies matters considerably," he said coldly. "Governor, I recommend immediate transfer to the county jail pending trial. Given the nature of the crime and the clear evidence, justice should be swift." Clara felt the world tilting around her as she realized that her attempt to save Elias had instead accelerated his destruction. The legal system would not recognize their love as genuine or their relationship as consensual. In the eyes of Mississippi law and society, Elias was guilty of rape simply by virtue of his race and enslaved status. "Please," she said, turning to address the assembled witnesses directly, "I'm begging you to understand. Elias is a good man. He's kind, intelligent, and gentle. He never hurt me or forced me to do anything. I pursued him because I saw in him qualities that I had never found in any of the men of my own social class." Her words, intended to humanize Elias and emphasize his positive qualities, had the opposite effect on her audience. The suggestion that an enslaved man might possess superior qualities to white gentlemen was seen as an even more dangerous transgression than the sexual relationship itself. Colonel Pemberton's face flushed with anger. "Governor, your daughter's words are not only inappropriate, but potentially seditious. She is suggesting that this property is superior to white men of good breeding. Such ideas are dangerous to the very foundation of our society." The political implications were becoming clear to Governor Hartwell. His daughter had not only created a personal scandal, but had articulated ideas that challenged the racial hierarchy upon which Southern society was built. Her public statements could be interpreted as abolitionist sentiment, which would make him a target of suspicion and potentially violence from pro-slavery extremists. "Clara," he said, his voice now carrying a note of desperation beneath the anger, "you will go to your room immediately and remain there until I decide how to handle this situation. You will speak to no one and see no one without my explicit permission." But Clara had passed the point of compliance. Having revealed the truth publicly, she was determined to see it through to whatever end awaited them. "I will not hide any more, Father," she said firmly, "and I will not abandon Elias to face the consequences of our choices alone." The standoff between father and daughter played out before an audience that was rapidly losing patience with the governor's inability to control the situation. Judge Whitmore stepped forward, with the authority of the law behind him. "Governor Hartwell," and he said formally, "I am placing the slave Elias under arrest for the rape of a white woman. He will be transferred immediately to the county jail to await trial." "No!" Clara cried out, moving to place herself between Elias and the judge. "I will not allow you to arrest him for a crime he did not commit." But Elias gently moved Clara aside, his touch brief but tender. "It's all right," he whispered to her. "This was always going to be the end. At least now I know that what we shared was real." The resignation in his voice broke Clara's heart, but it also strengthened her resolve. If the legal system would not recognize the truth of their relationship, she would find other ways to protect him. As Judge Whitmore signaled for Elias to be restrained, Clara made one final desperate play. "Judge Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying a new note of authority, "before you arrest Elias, I think you should know that I have written a detailed account of our relationship, including specific dates, locations, and circumstances. I have also documented my father's threats against Elias and his plans to have him killed or sold to prevent this truth from coming to light." The judge paused, recognizing the potential complications that such documentation could create. "What are you suggesting, Miss Hartwell?" "I'm suggesting that if Elias is harmed in any way, those documents will be sent to newspapers throughout the South, along with copies to prominent abolitionists in the North. The story of our love and the brutal response it provoked will become known far beyond Mississippi." The threat was carefully calculated. While Clara's confession had created a local scandal, the broader circulation of their story could have national implications. Northern abolitionists would seize upon the tale as evidence of the moral corruption of slavery, while Southern extremists would be outraged by what they saw as a betrayal by one of their own elite families. Governor Hartwell stared at his daughter with a mixture of admiration and horror. "Clara, you don't understand the forces you're unleashing. This goes far beyond our family now." "I understand perfectly, Father," Clara replied. "I understand that Elias's life is worth more than our family's reputation or your political career. I understand that love is more important than the artificial barriers that society has created to keep people apart." The philosophical challenge implicit in Clara's words struck at the heart of everything the assembled witnesses believed about race, class, and social order. Mrs. Pemberton spoke for many of them when she declared, "Such ideas are not only wrong but dangerous. They threaten the very fabric of civilized society." But Clara was beyond caring about social fabric or civilized society. She had found something real and precious in her relationship with Elias, and she was prepared to sacrifice everything to protect it. As the morning wore on, the confrontation evolved into a complex negotiation involving legal, political, and social considerations. Judge Whitmore was determined to see Elias punished as an example to other enslaved people who might be tempted to transgress racial boundaries. Governor Hartwell was focused on minimizing the political damage to his career. The other witnesses were concerned about the broader implications for Mississippi society. But Clara and Elias, standing together in the eye of the storm they had created, were focused on something simpler and more fundamental: the possibility of protecting their love and their unborn child in a world determined to destroy both. The negotiations would continue throughout the day, with various proposals and counter-proposals being discussed. Some suggested that Elias could be quietly sold to a distant plantation, allowing the scandal to fade from public memory. Others argued that only his public execution would satisfy the demands of justice and social order. Clara countered each proposal with threats to publicize their story more broadly, while also making increasingly desperate offers to sacrifice herself to save Elias. She proposed that she could be declared mentally incompetent and institutionalized, that she could flee the state and never return, or that she could publicly recant her story and claim that Elias had indeed forced himself upon her. But Elias, displaying a moral courage that impressed even his enemies, refused to allow Clara to destroy herself for his sake. "I won't let you lie to save me," he told her during a brief moment when they were allowed to speak privately. "What we shared was beautiful and true, and I won't let them turn it into something ugly." As the day progressed, it became clear that no easy solution existed. The scandal was too public, the legal implications too serious, and the social challenges too fundamental for any simple resolution. The first day of their public revelation ended with Elias under house arrest in the slave quarters, Clara confined to her room under guard, and Governor Hartwell frantically trying to manage a crisis that threatened to destroy everything he had built. But the story was far from over. Word of the scandal was already spreading beyond the Hartwell estate, carried by servants, visitors, and neighbors who had witnessed or heard about the morning's dramatic events. By nightfall, the tale of the governor's daughter and the enslaved young man was being whispered in drawing rooms, discussed in taverns, and debated in political circles throughout central Mississippi. The storm that Clara and Elias had unleashed was just beginning, and its ultimate resolution would test not only their love, but the very foundations of the society that sought to destroy them. The news of Clara Hartwell's shocking revelation spread through Mississippi society like wildfire in dry grass. Within 48 hours, the story had reached Jackson, Natchez, and Vicksburg, carried by a network of political allies, social connections, and simple gossip that connected the state's elite families. In the drawing rooms of plantation mansions, ladies whispered behind fans about the governor's daughter, who had lost her mind and claimed to love a slave. In the gentlemen's clubs of Jackson, politicians debated the implications for Governor Hartwell's career and the broader question of maintaining social order. In the slave quarters throughout the region, the story was told in hushed tones as a cautionary tale about the dangers of crossing racial boundaries. But nowhere was the impact more immediate and devastating than within the Hartwell mansion itself, where the family struggled to cope with the complete collapse of their carefully constructed world. Clara had been confined to her room for 3 days, with Bessie serving as both caretaker and guard. The loyal servant found herself in an impossible position, torn between her genuine affection for Clara and her understanding of the catastrophic nature of the situation. "Miss Clara," Bessie said on the morning of March 19th, as she brought breakfast to her mistress, "you got to eat something. This ain't helping nobody, especially not that baby you're carrying." Clara, who had barely touched food since her public confession, looked up from where she sat by the window, watching the grounds where Elias was being held under constant supervision. "How can I eat when I don't know if he's even alive?" "He's alive," Bessie assured her. "I seen him this morning when they brought him his meal. But Miss Clara, you got to understand. Your daddy's trying to find a way out of this that don't end with that boy dead and you ruined forever." The truth was that Governor Hartwell was engaged in the most complex political negotiation of his career, trying to balance competing demands from various factions, while protecting both his daughter and his own political future. Judge Whitmore continued to insist on a public trial and execution, arguing that anything less would encourage similar incidents throughout the state. "Governor," he had said during a private meeting, "if we don't make an example of this boy, every slave in Mississippi will think he can take liberties with white women." But other voices counseled a more cautious approach. Senator Robert Crawford, one of Hartwell's closest political allies, argued for a quieter resolution. "William," he said, "a public trial will only spread this story further. The Northern abolitionists are already getting wind of it, and they'll use it as propaganda against our entire way of life." The political calculations were complex and constantly shifting. A public trial would satisfy demands for justice, but would also provide a platform for Clara to repeat her claims about the consensual nature of her relationship with Elias. Her testimony could be used by abolitionists to argue that enslaved people were capable of genuine human emotions and relationships, challenging the fundamental justifications for slavery itself. On the other hand, a quiet resolution, perhaps selling Elias to a distant plantation and sending Clara away for medical treatment, might minimize the immediate scandal, but could be seen as weakness by pro-slavery extremists who demanded harsh punishment for any transgression of racial boundaries. Meanwhile, Clara was developing her own strategy for protecting Elias and their unborn child. During her confinement, she had been writing detailed accounts of their relationship, documenting not only their emotional connection, but also Elias's intelligence, kindness, and moral character. She was preparing to make these documents public if necessary, regardless of the consequences to herself or her family. "Bessie," Clara said on the 4th day of her confinement, I need you to help me get a message to someone." Bessie looked alarmed. "Miss Clara, your daddy said nobody in or out without his say-so." "Not someone here," Clara clarified. "Someone in Jackson. There's a lawyer there, Mr. Samuel Morrison, who has represented unusual cases. I need him to know about our situation." Bessie shook her head vigorously. "Miss Clara, you can't be thinking of bringing in outside lawyers. That'll just make everything worse." But Clara had moved beyond concern for making things worse. Her focus was entirely on finding some legal protection for Elias and some way to ensure that their child would not be born into a world that denied its very right to exist. Samuel Morrison was indeed an unusual lawyer for 1849 Mississippi. While not an abolitionist, he had occasionally represented enslaved people in legal disputes and had developed a reputation for taking cases that other attorneys avoided. More importantly, he had connections to northern legal networks that could provide broader protection if the situation escalated. Clara's message to Morrison, smuggled out through a sympathetic kitchen servant, was brief but compelling. The governor's daughter seeks legal counsel for herself and an enslaved man facing unjust prosecution, willing to pay any fee for immediate consultation. The message reached Morrison within 2 days, and his response was swift. He would travel to the Hartwell estate immediately, ostensibly as a family friend offering support during Clara's illness. Morrison's arrival on March 23rd created a new dynamic in the ongoing crisis. A tall, thin man with prematurely grey hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, he possessed the kind of legal mind that could find creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems. His first meeting was with Governor Hartwell, who was initially suspicious of the lawyer's motives. "Mr. Morrison," the governor said, "I appreciate your concern for our family during this difficult time, but I'm not sure what assistance you can provide." Morrison's response was carefully calibrated. "Governor, I understand that your daughter has been suffering from some form of nervous condition that has led to unusual behavior. I've had experience with similar cases, and I believe I might be able to help develop a legal framework that protects everyone involved." The phrase legal framework caught the governor's attention. He had been struggling with the legal implications of the situation, particularly the question of how to handle Clara's public statements without creating additional complications. "What kind of framework are you suggesting?" Hartwell asked. Morrison outlined a complex strategy that involved several interconnected elements. First, Clara could be declared temporarily incompetent due to her nervous condition, which would invalidate her public statements and remove the legal basis for prosecuting Elias for rape. Second, Elias could be quietly sold to a northern buyer who would transport him out of the state, effectively removing him from Mississippi jurisdiction. Third, Clara could be sent to a private medical facility where she could give birth in secret, with the child being placed for adoption with a family far from Mississippi. The plan was elegant in its complexity, providing face-saving solutions for all parties while avoiding the explosive potential of a public trial. But it required the cooperation of both Clara and Elias, neither of whom had been consulted about their own fates. Morrison's meeting with Clara took place that same evening, in the library where she and Elias had first discovered their intellectual connection. Clara listened carefully to the lawyer's proposal, but her response was immediate and unequivocal. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "I appreciate your efforts to help, but I will not agree to any plan that separates me from Elias, or that treats our relationship as a symptom of mental illness." Morrison had expected this response, and he was prepared with alternatives. "Miss Hartwell, I understand your feelings, but you must consider the practical realities. If this situation goes to trial, Elias will almost certainly be executed. If you continue to insist on the validity of your relationship, you will be declared insane and institutionalized indefinitely. Your child will be taken from you and raised by strangers who will never tell them the truth about their parentage." The stark reality of Morrison's words hit Clara like a physical blow, but they also strengthened her resolve. "Then we need to find a fourth option," she said firmly, "one that allows us to be together and to raise our child with dignity." Morrison studied the young woman before him, recognizing a determination that would not be easily swayed. "Miss Hartwell, there is no legal framework in Mississippi, or anywhere in the South, that would permit a white woman to marry an enslaved man or to acknowledge their child as legitimate. The laws simply don't exist. Then perhaps it's time to challenge those laws, Clara replied. The suggestion was so radical that Morrison actually stepped backward. Miss Hartwell, what you're proposing would require a fundamental transformation of Southern society. It would mean challenging not just individual laws, but the entire legal and social structure that supports slavery. Clara met his gaze steadily. Mr. Morrison, if our love can create a child, then perhaps it can also create change. The conversation continued late into the evening, with Morrison gradually coming to understand that Clara was not seeking a way to escape the consequences of her choices, but rather a way to transform those consequences into something positive and meaningful. Meanwhile, Elias was facing his own impossible situation. Confined to a small room in the slave quarters and guarded constantly, he had been visited by various people seeking to understand his motivations and to determine his fate. Judge Whitmore had interrogated him extensively, seeking evidence that he had somehow coerced or manipulated Clara into their relationship. But Elias's consistent testimony that Clara had initiated their friendship and that their relationship had developed naturally from mutual respect and affection frustrated the judge's attempts to construct a narrative of predatory behavior. "Boy," Judge Whitmore had said during one particularly intense session, "you expect me to believe that a refined young lady of good breeding would willingly debase herself with someone like you?" Elias's response had been quiet but dignified. "Sir, I can only tell you what happened. Miss Clara saw something in me that I had never seen in myself. She treated me like a human being worthy of respect and affection. I never asked for more than that, but when she offered it, I couldn't refuse." The simple honesty of Elias's testimony created problems for those who wanted to paint him as a villain. Several of the people who interviewed him came away with the uncomfortable recognition that he possessed intelligence, moral character, and genuine feeling that challenged their assumptions about the nature of enslaved people. Dr. Henry Caldwell, the family physician who had been called in to examine both Clara and Elias for signs of mental instability or physical coercion, found himself particularly troubled by his interactions with the young man. "Governor," Dr. Caldwell reported after his examination, "I can find no evidence of mental deficiency or moral corruption in the boy. He appears to be intelligent, articulate, and genuinely concerned for Miss Clara's welfare. His behavior throughout this crisis has been remarkably selfless and dignified." The doctor's assessment created additional complications for those seeking a simple resolution to the crisis. If Elias could not be dismissed as mentally deficient or morally corrupt, then his relationship with Clara took on a more troubling complexity that challenged fundamental assumptions about race and human nature. As March drew to a close, the various parties involved in the crisis found themselves locked in an increasingly complex negotiation with no clear resolution in sight. Clara remained determined to protect Elias and to acknowledge their child publicly. Elias continued to accept responsibility for their relationship while refusing to allow Clara to sacrifice herself for his sake. Governor Hartwell struggled to find a solution that would protect his daughter while preserving his political career, and the broader Mississippi political establishment grappled with the implications of a case that challenged the very foundations of their social order. The situation was further complicated by growing external pressure. Northern newspapers had begun to pick up the story, with abolitionist publications portraying Clara and Elias as star-crossed lovers whose persecution demonstrated the moral bankruptcy of slavery. Southern newspapers responded with editorials condemning Clara's madness and demanding harsh punishment for Elias as an example to other enslaved people. The national attention meant that whatever resolution was reached would have implications far beyond Mississippi. The case was becoming a symbol in the broader national debate over slavery, with both sides seeking to use it to advance their political agendas. But for Clara and Elias, the political implications were secondary to their immediate concern for each other and their unborn child. As they faced an uncertain future, they drew strength from the knowledge that their love had already accomplished something remarkable. It had forced an entire society to confront the contradictions and cruelties of its own moral foundations. The final resolution of their crisis would test not only their personal courage, but the capacity of American society to evolve beyond the racial barriers that had defined it since its founding. As April arrived with its promise of spring renewal, the Hartwell estate had become the epicenter of a national controversy that would reshape the conversation about slavery, love, and human dignity in antebellum America. The pressure from multiple directions had reached a breaking point. Northern abolitionists were organizing rallies in support of Clara and Elias, portraying them as symbols of love transcending artificial racial barriers. Southern extremists were demanding immediate and harsh punishment as a deterrent to other potential transgressions. Political moderates sought a quiet resolution that would allow the controversy to fade from public memory. But Clara Hartwell had evolved beyond the frightened young woman who had first confessed her pregnancy. The weeks of confinement, negotiation, and public scrutiny had transformed her into a formidable advocate for her own beliefs and the man she loved. On April 3rd, she made a decision that would change everything. Using connections that Morrison had helped her establish, Clara arranged for a detailed written account of her relationship with Elias to be published simultaneously in newspapers across the North and South. The document, titled A True Account of Love and Persecution in Mississippi, was a powerful and eloquent defense of their relationship that challenged readers to see beyond racial prejudices to the fundamental humanity of all people. "I write these words," Clara's account began, "not to seek sympathy or forgiveness, but to bear witness to a love that has taught me more about human dignity than 18 years of privileged education ever could. Elias has shown me that intelligence, kindness, and moral character are not determined by the color of one's skin or the circumstances of one's birth, but by the content of one's heart and the choices one makes in life." The publication of Clara's account created a sensation that reverberated across the nation. In the North, it was hailed as a courageous testimony to the humanity of enslaved people and the moral corruption of slavery itself. In the South, it was condemned as the ravings of a mentally unstable woman who had been manipulated by abolitionist agitators. But the most powerful impact was on the thousands of ordinary people who read Clara's words and found themselves questioning assumptions they had never before examined. Her detailed descriptions of Elias's intelligence, sensitivity, and moral character forced readers to confront the possibility that enslaved people possessed the same capacity for thought, feeling, and love as their white counterparts. The response to Clara's publication was swift and dramatic. Governor Hartwell found himself under enormous pressure from political allies who demanded that he disavow his daughter's statements and take decisive action against Elias. Judge Whitmore issued a warrant for Elias's immediate arrest and trial, arguing that Clara's public statements constituted additional evidence of his crimes. But Clara had anticipated these responses and had prepared her own counter-strategy. Working with Morrison and a network of sympathetic lawyers, she had developed a legal challenge that would test the very foundations of Mississippi's slave laws. On April 10th, Morrison filed a formal petition in federal court, arguing that Elias was being denied due process under the Constitution. The petition claimed that Mississippi's laws regarding relationships between white women and enslaved men violated the fundamental principle that all people were entitled to equal protection under the law. The legal argument was revolutionary for its time, anticipating by more than a century the civil rights challenges that would eventually dismantle legal segregation. Morrison argued that the assumption that no white woman could willingly engage in a relationship with an enslaved man was based on racial prejudice rather than legal principle, and that prosecuting Elias for rape, when Clara insisted their relationship was consensual, violated his constitutional rights. The federal petition created a legal crisis that extended far beyond Mississippi. If the federal courts accepted Morrison's arguments, it could potentially invalidate slave laws throughout the South and provide a legal foundation for challenging the entire institution of slavery. Southern politicians reacted with fury and alarm. Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi declared that the federal government had no authority to interfere with state laws regarding slavery and racial relationships. Governor Hartwell found himself caught between his loyalty to his daughter and his political obligations to his constituents. But the legal challenge also created an opportunity for a negotiated resolution that could satisfy multiple parties while avoiding a potentially explosive federal court decision. The negotiations that followed were complex and involved multiple levels of government, legal authorities and political interests. The final agreement, reached in late April, was a compromise that reflected the limited possibilities for justice within the constraints of 1849 American society. Under the terms of the agreement, Elias would be granted his freedom and provided with transportation to a northern state where he could live as a free man. Clara would be allowed to join him after giving birth, with the understanding that she would forfeit any claim to her family's property or social position in Mississippi. Their child would be born free and would have the legal right to education and full citizenship in whatever state they chose to reside. In exchange, Clara would publicly acknowledge that her relationship with Elias had been inappropriate given the social customs of the time, and she would refrain from further public advocacy that could be seen as challenging the institution of slavery. The federal legal challenge would be withdrawn, and no precedent would be set that could be used to challenge slave laws in other cases. The agreement was far from perfect, requiring significant sacrifices from both Clara and Elias, while failing to address the broader injustices of slavery. But it offered them something that had seemed impossible just weeks earlier: the opportunity to be together and to raise their child in freedom. The final confrontation between Clara and her father took place on the day before her departure from Mississippi. Governor Hartwell, aged by the crisis and facing an uncertain political future, struggled to understand how his carefully ordered world had been so completely transformed. "Clara," he said, his voice heavy with sadness and confusion, "I still don't understand how you could throw away everything, your family, your position, your future, for this." Clara, now visibly pregnant and preparing for a journey into an uncertain but hopeful future, met her father's gaze with compassion rather than anger. "Father," she replied, "I haven't thrown anything away. I've discovered something more valuable than social position or family wealth. I've learned what it means to love someone for who they truly are, rather than what society expects them to be. I've found my own voice and my own values, independent of the expectations that others have placed on me." The governor shook his head, still unable to accept his daughter's choices. "But Clara, you're condemning yourself to a life of hardship and social exile. You'll never be accepted in polite society again." "Perhaps," Clara acknowledged, "but I'll be living an authentic life based on my own convictions rather than a false life based on others' prejudices. And my child will grow up knowing that love is more powerful than hatred, that human dignity transcends artificial barriers, and that courage can create change even in the most unlikely circumstances." The farewell between father and daughter was painful, but not bitter. Despite their fundamental disagreements, both recognized the love that had shaped their relationship and the different paths that their convictions had led them to follow. Elias's departure from the Hartwell estate was witnessed by the entire enslaved community, many of whom had known him since birth. His mother, Sarah, embraced him with tears of joy and sorrow, proud of his courage, but fearful for his future. "You be careful out there," she whispered to her son, "and you take good care of Miss Clara and that baby. They're going to need you to be strong." Elias nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility he was accepting. "Mama, I promise I'll make you proud, and someday when things change, I'll come back for you." The promise was one that Elias would spend the rest of his life working to fulfill, using his freedom to advocate for the abolition of slavery and the rights of those still held in bondage. The journey north was both a physical and symbolic passage from one world to another. Clara and Elias, traveling together as husband and wife under assumed names, experienced for the first time what it meant to move through society as equals rather than as master and slave. Their destination was Philadelphia, where Morrison had arranged for them to be received by a Quaker family with connections to the Underground Railroad. The city's large free black population and strong abolitionist community would provide them with the support and protection they needed to build a new life. Clara gave birth to their son William in September 1849 in a small but comfortable house in Philadelphia's Germantown neighborhood. The birth was attended by a skilled midwife and celebrated by their new community of friends and supporters who saw the child as a symbol of hope for a more just future. William Hartwell Freeman, as he would come to be known, grew up in a household that valued education, moral courage, and social justice. His parents' story became part of his identity, teaching him that love could indeed transcend the artificial barriers that society created to divide people. Elias, now calling himself Elias Freeman, found work as a carpenter and quickly established himself as a skilled craftsman and respected member of the community. His intelligence and natural leadership abilities, which had been suppressed during his years of enslavement, flourished in freedom. He became active in abolitionist circles, speaking at meetings and writing articles about his experiences under slavery. Clara adapted to her new life with remarkable resilience. Though she had lost the material comforts of her privileged upbringing, she found fulfillment in teaching at a school for free black children and in supporting her husband's advocacy work. Her education and social skills, combined with her unique perspective as a white woman who had chosen to cross racial boundaries, made her an effective spokesperson for the abolitionist cause. Their marriage, formalized in a Quaker ceremony in 1850, was one of the first legally recognized interracial marriages in Pennsylvania. The ceremony was attended by prominent abolitionists, including William Lloyd Garrison and Lucretia Mott, who saw Clara and Elias as living proof that racial prejudice was learned rather than natural. The couple's story continued to resonate throughout the 1850s as the national debate over slavery intensified. Clara's published account was reprinted numerous times and translated into several languages, spreading their message of love transcending racial barriers to audiences around the world. When the Civil War began in 1861, Elias enlisted in one of the first black regiments, serving with distinction as a sergeant in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. His military service was motivated not only by patriotism, but by his desire to help free others who remained in bondage, including his mother Sarah, who was still enslaved on a Mississippi plantation. Clara supported the war effort by organizing relief supplies for black soldiers and by continuing her advocacy work through speaking engagements and written articles. Her unique perspective as a white woman married to a black man gave her insights into both the promise and the challenges of racial integration that would prove valuable during the Reconstruction era. The war's end brought both triumph and tragedy for the Freeman family. Elias survived his military service and was present at the surrender at Appomattox, but the news that his mother had died during the war's final year left him devastated. Sarah had lived to see the Emancipation Proclamation, but had died before experiencing the freedom that her son had found 15 years earlier. In the post-war years, the Freeman family became prominent figures in Philadelphia's black community and in the broader movement for civil rights. William Freeman, educated at prestigious northern universities, became a lawyer and civil rights advocate who would later play a role in the early NAACP. Elias and Clara's marriage lasted until Elias's death in 1889, 40 years after their dramatic departure from Mississippi. Their love story had evolved from a scandalous romance into a testament to the possibility of building a life based on mutual respect, shared values, and commitment to justice. Clara lived until 1903, long enough to see her son establish himself as a successful attorney and to welcome grandchildren who grew up in a world where their mixed-race heritage was a source of pride rather than shame. In her final years, she often reflected on the choices she had made as a young woman and the unexpected journey those choices had set in motion. "I thought I was simply following my heart," she wrote in her memoirs, published shortly before her death. "I had no idea that our love would become part of a larger story about human dignity and the possibility of change. But perhaps that's how all meaningful change begins, with individuals who choose to act on their convictions rather than conform to society's expectations." The legacy of Clara and Elias Freeman extended far beyond their own lives. Their story became part of the historical record that documented the humanity and dignity of enslaved people, challenging the racist narratives that had been used to justify slavery. Their successful marriage and family life provided evidence that interracial relationships could thrive when freed from the constraints of legal and social oppression. More importantly, their courage in facing the consequences of their choices inspired others to challenge unjust laws and social customs. Their story was cited by civil rights advocates throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries as proof that love and human dignity could triumph over prejudice and hatred. The Hartwell plantation in Mississippi, meanwhile, never recovered from the scandal. Governor Hartwell's political career ended with his daughter's departure, and the family's social standing was permanently damaged. The estate was eventually sold, and the Hartwell name faded from Mississippi politics. But in Philadelphia, and later in other northern cities where their descendants settled, the Freeman name became associated with education, civil rights advocacy, and the ongoing struggle for racial justice. William Freeman's children and grandchildren continued the family tradition of fighting for equality, participating in the civil rights movement of the 1960s and beyond. The house in Germantown where Clara and Elias had built their new life became a stop on historical tours highlighting Philadelphia's role in the abolitionist movement. A plaque installed in 1949 on the centennial of their arrival in the city read, "In this house lived Clara and Elias Freeman, whose love transcended the racial barriers of their time and whose courage helped pave the way for a more just society." Their story, which had begun with a moment of recognition between a young enslaved man and a privileged white woman, had evolved into something larger than either could have imagined. It became part of the ongoing American story of struggle toward the ideals of equality and justice that the nation's founders had proclaimed but failed to fully realize. In the end, Clara and Elias Freeman's legacy was not just their successful marriage or their accomplished children, but their demonstration that ordinary people, acting on their deepest convictions about love and human dignity, could challenge and ultimately help transform the most entrenched systems of oppression. Their love story, born in the shadows of a Mississippi plantation and nurtured in the freedom of a northern city, became a testament to the power of human connection to transcend artificial barriers and create lasting change. It reminded future generations that progress often begins with individuals who choose love over fear, truth over convenience, and justice over conformity. As the 20th century dawned and America continued its long struggle toward racial equality, the story of Clara and Elias Freeman remained a source of inspiration for those who believed that love, courage, and moral conviction could indeed change the world. If this incredible true story of love, courage, and the fight for justice moved you, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Share this video with others who need to hear this powerful message about how love can triumph over hatred and how ordinary people can create extraordinary change. What did you think of Clara and Elias's incredible journey? Have you ever had to choose between love and social expectations? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to choose courage over conformity. And remember, their legacy lives on in every person who chooses to stand up for what's right, even when the whole world seems against them. Sometimes the most powerful revolution begins with a single act of love.